Shabbat Shalom, everyone. You may be seated. For those of you who are not Shabbat regulars or don't know my family, well, we usually, when it's not a global pandemic happening, we spend our summers in Israel. And my kids are blessed. My daughter is 16. My son is 13. They've been to Israel 15 times, so it's very native to them. I think they've been there more than they've been to Florida. And our favorite day, probably, when we're spending our summers in Israel, is Friday. Because what happens on Friday, especially when our kids were little, is we would get up early, and we would go to the local bakery. We would pick up some very sweet things for Shabbat dinner, including some fresh challahs. And then we would pack in the car with our towels, and we would head to Tel Aviv to the beach. Because we live in New Jersey, and we don't spend much time at a beach. And I was always captured when we packed in the car, and we got to the last stoplight in Jerusalem before we hit the number 1 highway. And it really was the last stoplight until we got to Tel Aviv. And at that stoplight, there were throngs of ultra-Orthodox men. Long beards, black coats, hats, payas, the side locks, and tzitzis hanging out from their clothing. And there was a sense of them preparing for Shabbos, for getting ready for Shabbos. They were walking around, getting rides to whatever town they needed to go to, and you could feel Shabbos was in the air. And that was the last view for about 60 minutes. And then we would arrive in Tel Aviv. And when we got to Tel Aviv, made our way to the beaches, we would be greeted by women in very skimpy bikinis, and men who had no yarmulkes on their head and were totally covered in tattoos. And they were busy making plans for brunch and evening plans that did not include Kabbalat Shabbat and Mariv, didn't include davening on Friday. My kids would make sandcastles. They would play in the Mediterranean and ride the waves, and we would drink these frozen fruit drinks to spell us from the oppressive heat. And we would have the most amazing time in Tel Aviv. Then we would dust off the sand, get back in the car, and we would make the 60-minute, 43-mile trek back up the hills of Jerusalem. We would make it back to our apartment in Jerusalem, and then we would shower off just in time to hear the alarm that rings throughout the entire city of Jerusalem, telling us that Shabbat is about to arrive. Here we were in this ancient city, in this ancient country, and we never really paused to see the difference that 43 miles made. When we were in Jerusalem, you could see and smell and taste and feel a sense of the imminence, the about to happenness of Shabbat. You could sense it on the street corner. You could sense it in the grocery store. You could sense it in a gas station. It was everywhere. So much so that a siren goes off in the entire town telling people that Shabbat is beginning. But just 43 miles away, 60-minute ride, it's like we took a time machine to a different place. In the hills of Jerusalem is the city of King David, the city and the place where it's told that Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac on Mount Moriah, which is where the Temple Mount was, where sacrifices and the temple used to be, where all of these stones of yesterday connect us to a stone of today and tie us door to door from one generation to the next. And when we go to Tel Aviv, that salty sea air smacks us in the face, and we get an absolute sense of the majesty and miracle of the homeland. We get the idea of Dizengoff and Jabotinsky, who dreamt of turning sand dunes into skyscrapers, and when you look around, indeed, that is what they did. 2 miracles, 43 miles apart, under the same flag, totally different styles of life, for the most part. Now, in Tel Aviv, just like in Jerusalem, Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, is a national holiday. And both groups of people celebrate that day. In Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem, you will find stores that sell falafel and shawarma, and you will find natives of both towns that love eating both. And the tears of the Jerusalemite and the tears of the Tel Avivan are just as salty when they mourn the loss of someone who was killed defending the homeland of Israel. So they share those common denominators in the way in which they protect the land, the way in which they love the land, and the way in which they celebrate the land. But 43 miles is a time machine of difference. It's as if that 43 miles is 4,000 miles. It's 4,000 years. It is of wild difference. But here's the thing. I love Tel Aviv. I love Jerusalem. And I could find myself incredibly happy in both environments, as many people can. Now, granted, we choose to spend our summers living in Jerusalem because that's a better fit for me and for our family. But it doesn't take away my love for Tel Aviv and my appreciation for Tel Aviv. Why am I telling you this on this Shabbat? I'm telling you this because, like you, and like you at home, I have spent the last almost 2 weeks glued to the newspapers and the televisions. And while personally I am satisfied with the results of the election, what has become abundantly clear as a process of this election is how passionately divided this country, America, is. And what I fear is that most of us live in our Tel Aviv or our Jerusalem of our American life, but have no idea of what it is to appreciate the life of the other. And if you think I'm being far-fetched or you think I'm being outlandish, I want to point out a statistic that didn't surprise me, it didn't shock me, but at the same time it blew my mind, if that makes any sense. And here it is. Donald Trump won 75% of the counties that had a Cracker Barrel in it. The restaurant Cracker Barrel, if your county hosted or has a Cracker Barrel in it, the chances were 3 out of 4, 75%, that Donald Trump will win that county, and he did. And Donald Trump only won 19% of counties that had a Whole Foods. Most of the counties that had a Whole Foods, Joe Biden won by 80%. And I don't know of any county that hosts both a Whole Foods and a Cracker Barrel. Now here's the God's honest truth. The last time I was in a Cracker Barrel, I was 11 years old. I was traveling with my parents from some road trip, because we always took road trips, and we stopped, and it was the last choice, and we were starving, and we went inside it, and I can barely remember what it was, but I do remember the feeling that this is not my people. This is not my place. I remember that. But I can also tell you that whenever I travel anywhere in the world, especially before there was a pandemic, when I saw a Whole Foods, it was like a ray of light came out. Now, granted, I probably had to refinance the house in order to go shopping there, but I used to love to go and pick up either a fresh soup or a fresh sandwich or sushi or other things that were there because I loved, and still do, Whole Foods. So one of them is native to me and one of them isn't, but the problem is that the American flag hangs proudly over the grocery store of Whole Foods and over the grocery store of the Cracker Barrel. And perhaps it's a time for us as Americans in this deep divide to spend a little bit of time at more Cracker Barrels and more Whole Foods, depending on what is more native to us. Because unless we become aware of the other in a way that we can demonstrate some patience, some tolerance, some compassion, some empathy, some understanding, we will continue to be in a vicious divide. And God knows what will get us back together. I fear for those shots, and I mean that word advisedly, shots that always seem to shock a country back into a shared rhythm. They are moments of tragedy and trauma, not of triumph and celebration. A few years ago, I was selected to go on a special trip to Israel. It was a trip sponsored by a group called Encounter, where they captured a group of people from all different backgrounds. Some were rabbis, some were educators, some were lay leaders, some were older, some were younger, male, female, heterosexual, homosexual, every stripe of humanity one could imagine. And we spent 5 days in Israel. We spent 1 day really in Israel, and then we spent 4 days going into Palestinian territory. These are the places in Palestinian territory where if you've been to Israel, they have those huge red signs that says it's illegal for Israelis to enter. We had to get special permission to go into it. And the idea of this trip is exactly what the title of the trip is. It's Encounter. The idea was to go into a place and a part of a country that you're otherwise not familiar with and native with, and to hear the conversations, the communication, the challenges, the opportunities of the people who live there. And as someone who could go to Israel as much as 8 times in 1 year, I had never spent that amount of time within the city of Bethlehem, within East Jerusalem, within parts of Nablus or Jericho or Ramallah. Now here's the incredible part. When I left that visit, those 4 days, I was really glad to be back home, first in Israel, in West Jerusalem, in the familiar parts of the town in which I knew and was native to, and glad to be home in my own homeland when I came back to New Jersey. It didn't mean that my political views all of a sudden shifted 90 degrees or 180 degrees, but it sure did give me some talking points, some perspective, some opportunity to see things from a perspective that I often never even bothered to see. And that mattered. And on some issues, it moved the needle for me. On other issues, it hardened the needle for me. And in some places, it caused me deep thought, which I think was exactly the trip's intention. But you can't even begin that deep thought, that contemplation, the moving of a needle or the strengthening of that needle, unless you are willing to go into that place that you're not native to in the first place. Unless you do that, then we are challenged forever. In the parsha in which we read today, Abraham comes down from the mountain where he almost sacrificed his son Isaac to find that his wife died. And one of the reasons that people believe that Sarah died is not only from the trauma of what she heard had happened to Isaac, but because she was all alone. She died alone. She didn't have her son. She didn't have her husband. She didn't have anyone around her. She died alone. And boy, if that isn't tragic, I don't know what is. She died by herself. Judaism tells us that we should not, where we can, have someone we care and love for die alone. In Judaism, we find our strength not through a sense of unanimity where we all agree. We find our strength through loving, respectful debate and conversation. But we can only do that if we can be comfortable in each other's spaces and not create voids where people are alone and by themselves. Because if we do that, then the divides only grow. Then the rift becomes a gulf. Then 43 miles between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv might as well be a 10-hour flight away. Because if we can't stop and appreciate life from another perspective, another narrative, another challenge, then we can't grow individually and communally. Perhaps it's time for some of us, like myself, to spend a little bit more time in the Cracker Barrels of life. And perhaps it's time for some of those who go to Cracker Barrel often to come and visit some more Whole Foods and to hear and to see and to appreciate the different narratives that make up this gorgeous and beautiful experiment that we are blessed to live in, called the United States of America. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We're going to continue our service on page 184. The cantor leads us in the Chatzi Kaddish, after which we're going to rise for the Musaf Amidah on page 185. Please rise.
יתגדל ויתקדש שם רבה ועמד יבחרותי וימליך